The lecture hall at Harvard was filled with the usual hum of chatter as students took their seats. At the front of the room stood Professor Whitman, a man known for his sharp tongue and his pride in humiliating anyone who dared to question him. He thrived on attention and the sound of laughter whenever he mocked someone who slipped up in class. That day, however, an unfamiliar figure entered the room. An elderly woman with silver hair neatly tied back and kind eyes hidden behind modest glasses walked in quietly carrying a small notebook. She looked slightly out of place among the young students, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. Whispers rippled through the room as she took a seat in the front row, ignoring the curious stares that followed her. Professor Whitman raised his brows and smirked, clearly amused by her presence. He began his lecture with booming confidence, striding back and forth across the stage, as if he were performing for an audience. Every so often his eyes flicked toward the woman as though daring her to keep up with the pace of his complicated explanations. Midway through the lecture he paused and asked her a pointed question, one laced with condescension, meant to catch her off guard. The room grew quiet, waiting for the inevitable stumble. But to everyone's surprise, the elderly woman answered calmly, her explanation clear, precise, and rooted in knowledge deeper than even the students could follow. The professor chuckled dismissively and tried again, posing a more complex question, this time with a smug grin. Once again, she responded flawlessly, her words carrying both wisdom and authority, as if she had lived a lifetime within the subject. A ripple of murmurs spread across the lecture hall, students sitting up straighter, leaning and eager to hear more. Professor Whitman's smile faltered, but he pressed on, asking question after question, his tone sharpening with each attempt to corner her. Yet the woman answered every one with ease, never raising her voice, never seeking attention, only speaking the truth with calm certainty. The students who once laughed at the professor's mockery now turned their eyes toward her, admiration clear on their faces. And for the first time, the professor found himself on the losing end of a battle he had started with arrogance. His pride bristled, but the more he pushed, the more obvious it became that this elderly woman carried a mind far greater than his own carefully polished reputation. Professor Whitman shifted uncomfortably behind the podium, his usual confidence slipping like sand through his fingers. He cleared his throat and tried to disguise his unease with a forced laugh, but the students were no longer looking at him with awe, they were looking at her. The elderly woman adjusted her glasses, her expression calm, as though she had no interest in humiliating him, only in sharing what she knew. One of the braver students raised a hand and asked her a question, bypassing the professor altogether. She turned to the student and answered with such clarity that the room leaned in, hanging on every word. Professor Whitman's jaw tightened, his control of the lecture slipping further as more students directed their curiosity toward her. With every answer she gave, she revealed layers of knowledge not found in the textbook, stories of real experience woven into her explanations. Her words painted history and science with color and life, and the students listened as if they had never heard these subjects taught before. Whitman attempted to interrupt, but each time his interjection only made him look smaller compared to the grace and certainty of her presence. The students began taking notes rapidly, not from his slides but from her words. The elderly woman finally looked at him directly, her eyes gentle but steady, as if reminding him that wisdom was not measured in age or title, but in depth of understanding. For the first time in his career, Professor Whitman felt exposed, stripped of the shield of arrogance that had carried him for so long. The lecture hall no longer belonged to him, it belonged to the woman who had walked in quietly and now commanded the room without effort. Professor Whitman gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles pale as he searched for a way to reclaim the room. He raised his voice louder than before, but the students barely glanced at him, their pens racing to capture the words the elderly woman spoke. The silence that once followed his lectures now followed her, each pause filled with anticipation instead of fear. Whitman tried to regain authority by challenging her with a problem complex and obscure, one he believed no one could solve without years of training. The room waited, all eyes on her as she studied the question, her expression thoughtful but unshaken. Then she began to speak, unraveling the problem step by step, her explanations simple enough for every student to follow, yet brilliant enough to silence even the most skeptical. By the time she finished, the chalkboard was filled with clean, precise answers, and the lecture hall erupted in quiet applause. The professor stood frozen, unable to mask his disbelief, while the elderly woman simply returned to her seat and opened her notebook once again. She did not gloat, she did not boast, her presence carried no arrogance, only the calm assurance of a lifetime spent learning. The students exchanged glances, their respect for her growing with every moment. For Whitman, the realization was heavy. His authority had cracked in front of the very audience he valued most. And still the elderly woman sat silently, waiting for the lecture to continue as if she had done nothing unusual at all. Professor Whitman wiped his brow with a handkerchief, his voice faltering as he attempted to continue the lecture. His words stumbled, as though the confidence that once carried him had been drained by her quiet strength. Students who had once hung on his every phrase now barely lifted their eyes from their notes of her explanations. The air in the room had shifted, no longer tense with fear of being mocked, but alive with curiosity and admiration. One student leaned forward and asked her another question, this time about a theory Whitman himself had struggled to explain in past lectures. The elderly woman smiled softly and answered with a clarity that illuminated every detail, leaving the students nodding in understanding. Whitman had taught the same theory for years, yet in a few sentences she had revealed its elegance and simplicity. The students began whispering to each other, not out of mockery but excitement, and their eyes lit up as though a new world had opened before them. Whitman tried to interject with a correction, but his voice cracked, and the correction only highlighted how much weaker his explanation sounded beside hers. She looked at him kindly, not with malice, but with patience, as if she saw the man beneath the arrogance, still capable of learning. The professor shifted uncomfortably, sensing that for the first time in his long career, he was no longer the authority in his own lecture hall. And still the elderly woman sat poised and unassuming, her presence commanding without force, her wisdom undeniable to all who listened. Professor Whitman glanced at the clock on the wall, but the minutes seemed to stretch longer than usual. Every second of silence pressed heavier on him as the students leaned toward the elderly woman, waiting for her next words. He tapped his chalk against the board, but even the sound failed to capture attention. A student in the back raised a hand and asked her if she had ever taught before. The elderly woman gave a modest smile and replied that she had spent many years researching and writing, though teaching was never her profession. Her answer surprised the students even more because the way she explained concepts felt more alive and clear than any lecture they had attended. Whitman forced a laugh and tried to dismiss her as someone who had read too many books, but the students knew better. They had felt the difference. Another student asked her to expand on her earlier explanation, and she did so with the same calm precision, filling the hall with insight that made even the most difficult ideas feel natural. Whitman shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his pride eroding with each nod of admiration directed toward her. The lecture hall, which had once been his stage, now felt like unfamiliar ground slipping away beneath him. Yet the elderly woman carried no trace of triumph. She remained gentle, her voice steady, her focus only on sharing knowledge. The contrast between her humility and his arrogance grew sharper with every passing moment. And as she spoke, the students could see clearly who held the true brilliance in that room. Professor Whitman tried to steady his breathing, but the murmur of admiration for the elderly woman echoed louder than anything he said. He scribbled formulas on the board, his handwriting jagged, as if to remind the class of his authority, but the students' eyes stayed fixed on her. One of the front row students asked her to explain the formula in her own way, and she rose from her seat, slowly walking to the chalkboard. Whitman stepped back, unwillingly giving her space, though his jaw tightened. She took the chalk and began to write, her hand steady, her movements confident. Her explanation flowed like water, weaving connections that no textbook could capture. The students leaned forward, completely absorbed, their pens moving quickly to capture her every word. Whitman watched helplessly as the power he had guarded for years slipped further from his grasp, replaced by the quiet brilliance of this woman who had entered his hall without fanfare. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, genuine and full, not forced like the nervous laughter he once drew from fear. She placed the chalk gently on the ledge and returned to her seat as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Whitman felt a sting of shame, but also something he had not felt in years, a spark of humility. The students looked at him, now not with the blind respect he had demanded, but with unspoken comparison to the calm authority of the elderly woman. And in that silence he realized that the lesson unfolding was not only for them, but for him as well. Professor Whitman cleared his throat, his voice softer than before, as he tried to continue the lecture. But each word he spoke sounded smaller beside the clarity the elderly woman had offered moments before. The students did not jeer or mock him, yet their attention was no longer his to command. It drifted naturally back to her, as if drawn by gravity. She sat calmly, her notebook resting on her lap, her hands folded with quiet patience. Whitman glanced at her, unable to stop himself from wondering who she truly was. Her answers, her poise, her brilliance, it was more than chance, it was mastery. One of the students whispered that she must be a retired scholar, another insisted she was probably an author of books they had never read. Whitman felt heat rising in his face, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. For the first time in years, he did not feel like the smartest person in the room, and the weight of that truth pressed heavily against him. The elderly woman finally looked his way, her gaze steady, but not unkind. It was not a gaze of victory or mockery, but of understanding, as though she knew exactly what he was feeling. The lecture hall fell into a hush, waiting for what would happen next. And in that silence Whitman felt something stir within him, a question he had long ignored, a question about whether knowledge was meant to control or to be shared freely, without arrogance. Professor Whitman stood frozen at the podium, his hands resting on the edge, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The students waited, their eyes shifting between him and the elderly woman, curiosity thick in the air. For years he had believed control was the mark of a teacher, but in this moment he realized the room was thriving without his dominance. A student raised a hand and asked if she might continue explaining the concept instead of him. Whitman hesitated, his pride pulling one way, his reason pulling another. Finally, he gave a stiff nod and stepped aside, his voice barely carrying as he told her she could proceed. The elderly woman rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her notebook still in hand. She began to speak again, weaving lessons into stories, making complex theories accessible to every ear in the hall. The students leaned forward, captivated, filling their pages with notes, their faces lit with understanding. Whitman watched the scene, his chest tight, but deep down he felt something he had not allowed himself in years: genuine awe. Every word she spoke revealed not only knowledge but also compassion, a desire to uplift rather than belittle. The room was no longer heavy with fear of being mocked, it was alive with discovery and inspiration. And for the first time, Professor Whitman began to see teaching not as a stage for pride, but as a bridge for connection. Professor Whitman sank into the chair beside the podium, his posture no longer towering but humbled. The students were entranced by the elderly woman, their pens moving furiously to capture every phrase she spoke. Her stories carried pieces of history, personal experiences woven into complex ideas, making them simple and alive. Whitman found himself listening to, his mind following her words with the same eagerness as the students around him. It had been years since he had felt the thrill of learning without ego, years since he had let knowledge enter without needing to prove superiority. The lecture hall, which had once echoed with his sharp remarks, now rang with clarity and warmth. Students who once feared raising their hands now asked questions freely, their voices filled with curiosity instead of hesitation. The elderly woman answered each one patiently, her tone steady and kind, never making anyone feel small for not knowing. Whitman studied her quietly, noticing the calm authority that required no performance, no raised voice, no mockery. It was the kind of authority built not on pride but on truth lived and understood. The weight of his arrogance pressed harder as he realized how much he had lost by teaching through fear instead of inspiration. And as he sat there listening, he could feel the foundations of his own beliefs beginning to shift with every word she spoke. Professor Whitman leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, as the elderly woman continued to guide the room. Her voice carried gently, yet every sentence held the strength of certainty and lived experience. Students who had once slouched in their chairs now sat upright, their eyes shining as though they had discovered a new way of seeing the world. Whitman noticed how even the quietest students, those who rarely spoke, were leaning in as if they too felt welcome in her presence. It struck him how different this was from his own lectures, where silence had come from fear rather than focus. For the first time, he could see the contrast laid bare, the difference between commanding respect and truly earning it. The elderly woman paused briefly, and in that stillness her eyes met his again, calm, unwavering, but never cruel. Whitman felt something shift deep inside, a recognition that his years of pride had built walls instead of bridges. The students waited eager for her to continue, yet Whitman felt compelled to speak, not with arrogance, but with sincerity. His voice trembled slightly as he thanked her for her explanation, though the words tasted unfamiliar on his tongue. The students glanced between them, sensing the change, the air thick, with an unspoken understanding that something profound was unfolding before their eyes. And in that moment Whitman began to wonder if perhaps this unexpected visitor had not come to embarrass him, but to remind him of what learning was meant to be. Professor Whitman let his words hang in the air, and the room grew quiet again. The elderly woman gave a small nod as if she accepted his gratitude, but then returned her attention to the students. She resumed her explanation, gently guiding them through ideas that once seemed distant and difficult, now appearing simple and clear. Whitman listened closely, every sentence peeling away layers of arrogance he had worn for so long. The students no longer seemed like an audience to dominate, but like young minds hungry for guidance and encouragement. He realized how much he had missed by focusing on authority instead of connection, how many opportunities to inspire he had let slip away. The woman spoke of learning as a lifelong journey, of questions never fully answered, of knowledge growing with humility, not pride. Whitman felt each word settle inside him like a mirror reflecting the teacher he could have been and still might become. The students clapped softly when she finished, not out of obligation, but from genuine appreciation. Whitman rose slowly from his chair, the weight of his years heavy, but his spirit strangely lighter. For the first time in a long while, he was not thinking of how to protect his reputation, but how to truly share the gift of knowledge. And as the students looked at him expectantly, he wondered what kind of professor he might choose to be now, with her example etched into his mind. Professor Whitman cleared his throat, the sound softer than usual, almost hesitant. The students watched him closely, curious about what he might say after everything that had just unfolded. He looked at the elderly woman, her calm gaze steady on him, and then he turned back to the class. Instead of giving a lecture, he asked a question, something simple, something that invited them to think and respond rather than sit in silence. The students exchanged surprised glances, some smiled, and slowly hands began to rise. For the first time, Whitman listened, not to correct or dismiss, but to understand and encourage. The room filled with voices, ideas flowing freely as the students spoke with confidence they had not shown before. Whitman felt a strange warmth building inside him, a sense of fulfillment he had long forgotten. The elderly woman remained seated in the corner, a quiet presence, her eyes glimmering with approval as she watched the transformation unfold. Whitman noticed her smile and realized it was not victory she carried, but a gentle satisfaction in seeing growth. It humbled him deeply, for all his years of prestige had never brought him such a moment of truth. And as the discussion carried on, he began to see not just a class in front of him, but the possibility of a new beginning for himself. Professor Whitman moved slowly across the room, no longer towering over the students, but walking among them. He paused at their desks, listening carefully to their thoughts, nodding, and asking gentle questions that pushed their ideas further. The students leaned into the conversation, energized by his new openness and eager to share more than they ever had before. It felt less like a lecture and more like a shared discovery, a space where everyone's voice mattered. Whitman realized he had never truly known these young people until now. He had only seen them as an audience, not as thinkers. The elderly woman sat quietly, yet her presence filled the room as if she had unlocked a door that had been locked for too long. Whitman caught her eye again, and for the first time, he felt not challenged by her, but guided by her. He understood now that brilliance was not about how loudly one spoke, but how deeply one could listen. The students laughed softly at each other's comments, the tension of the classroom replaced by an energy of curiosity. And as Whitman stood among them, he felt something he had not felt in years, the genuine joy of being a teacher. Professor Whitman rested his hand on the edge of a desk, listening to a shy student who rarely spoke. Her words were quiet but thoughtful, and the room grew still so that everyone could hear her. Whitman gave a small nod of encouragement, and for the first time, she lifted her eyes with confidence. The elderly woman watched with a gentle smile, her gaze moving between the professor and the students, as though she knew this was the change they had all needed. Whitman felt a strange lightness, as if a weight he had carried for decades was slowly slipping away. He realized his pride had not only distanced him from his students, but from the very purpose of his life's work. Now, standing here in the midst of open conversation, he saw clearly how knowledge was not meant to be guarded but shared. The students sensed the shift to their excitement building as they realized their thoughts were not being judged but valued. Whitman looked back at the elderly woman and gave a quiet nod of gratitude, words unspoken but deeply understood. And in that moment, the classroom felt transformed, no longer a place of hierarchy, but a circle of learning where every voice mattered. Professor Whitman stood at the front once more, though the space between him and the students no longer felt like a wall. He looked around the room, seeing not just young faces, but sparks of curiosity waiting to be nurtured. The elderly woman rose slowly from her seat, her calm presence still commanding respect without needing to demand it. She offered him a simple smile before turning to leave, her steps steady and graceful. Whitman felt an urge to call after her to thank her again, but he realized she had already given him the greatest gift she could. The students remained quiet as the door closed behind her, their eyes returning to him with a new kind of expectation. Whitman drew a long breath and, for the first time in years, spoke without arrogance. He told them that from this day forward the class would be different, that they would learn not only from him, but from one another. A ripple of relief and excitement spread across the room, the students sitting taller, ready for the change. And as Whitman continued, he knew deep in his heart that the lesson he had learned from the elderly woman would stay with him forever, guiding him to be the teacher he was always meant to be.